Hello and welcome back to Communications, Advanced Professional Communications. And here I want to sort of very quickly go over the structure of a research report. So this is the organization and writing of a business report or possibly even a case study. So what I want to do is show you how they're constructed in terms of what makes up a business report. The first thing clearly is the title page. That does make sense. And in the other set of slides, I'll go into detail as to what the title page should consist of. The second thing is a memo of transmittal. And what that is, it's also called an executive summary. And it is basically an overview of the work that the writer or writers, if it is a group, has done, the reason why they've been asked to do this, who will be the likely reader, which would be myself, and believe it or not, thanking me for the opportunity to study this in greater detail. That's why I wanted to give everyone a chance to sort of pick a topic of their own, because it isn't often the case in school that you get to study something you really are interested in or enjoy reading about. You're typically given a topic and you've got to go with it. But here, you can thank me for giving you the opportunity to look into whatever topic that you're writing about. The third thing is a table of contents, and as the title indicates here, it is simply a list of the contents of the report. These reports, depending on how many individual pages you have, will be between 10 to 12. So the table of contents will be broken down into sections. There might be more than one item on one page, and that's perfectly fine. But it is a list of the individual items that are in the report. Once we have the table of contents, a memo of transmittal, and the title page and everything else, we now move into sort of the first, let's say the front door, right? The front door of this report. And that's typically an introduction. The introduction gives us a brief overview, again, of the matter at hand, the major focus or the macro focus, and then followed by the micro focus, the main thesis, right? What aspect of this possibly larger topic are you going to address? And that's essentially where that introduction is going to make sense. Now here you don't have to provide a huge overview, but you're setting the stage, right? It's the opening act of this paper, this report that you've written, and you're going to give me enough information to at least guide me through it and say, okay, this is the main thesis, this is what I'm going to look for. And essentially that's what the introduction does. Now the hard part, of course, are the body paragraphs, and depending, if you look at it, you think, okay, title page, memo transmittal, table of contents, that's 3 pages already. Introduction doesn't necessarily have to be on a separate page. It can be sort of half a page long at the most. It depends how long the report is. But already here, the first 3 are 3 pages. So your body paragraphs, really when you think about it, are no more than 5 or 6 pages. So it really is the length of let's say an average essay of about 1,500 words. So the body paragraphs and the body of the report is found in that section. Now, just like the introduction can be on a separate page, the conclusions can also be on a separate page. And the conclusions, again, segue out of the body paragraphs, restate the introduction differently, of course. That's why I mean to say restate. They're not identical, because now I've already gone through the body paragraphs. I've now learned. So there's nothing wrong with reminding me what I've learned, because at the very least, I'll know whether or not I've been paying attention and that I've actually read it correctly. So the conclusions restate the introduction slightly differently, remind me of what it was that we were looking at, how you moved through the body paragraphs to a conclusion, and that's essentially how you end the report. Now the last part, a bibliography or works cited page, always important. The bibliography will contain all of the secondary sources that you used in the writing of this paper. So whatever you happen to call it, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to deduct marks for someone calling it a works cited rather than bibliography. The important thing, of course, is that that page is there, and it is in alphabetical order. If there are no authors, I'll show you how to set this up. This is, again, just sort of a very brief overview of the individual components, right? This is the formal aspects. Now, form is usually distinguished from content, and the content would be essentially here, right, in your body paragraphs in this section. So For the time being, formally speaking, your report should have the following pages: title, memo, contents, introduction, body paragraphs, conclusion, and a bibliography. So in terms of the structure, that's essentially what you want to look at. So the title page, you should try to balance the following lines. Now there is a set of slides which shows you basically a mock-up of like a sample business report. Take a look at that, how it's structured. I'm not going to make a video because there's a lot of verbiage in it, so just kind of have a look at it. But here, at least for the title page, what you want to do is set up the following: the name of the report in capital letters, the receiver's name, me, my title, professor or instructor, and the organization, Fanshawe College, the author's name. Now this could be RS apostrophe, so authors in plural or singular. For this year, because it's remote learning, it will be singular authors. So author's name, is that the way it should read? The title of the paper, and again, the organization, Fanshawe College, and the date submitted. And the date submitted, I believe, is Thursday, August 5th. Now, double check. This is just kind of off the top of my head. So it is Thursday, August 5th will be the submission date. Excuse me. Even if you send it in ahead of time, that will be the submission date that should be required. Now, the letter of transmittal, as I mentioned in the beginning, it announces the topic, both in a macro and in a micro level. So kind of an overview, and then the main thesis, that's the micro part. So you announce your topic, you describe the project, and preview the conclusions. And there's nothing wrong with that, because here I'm not demanding that you save me money, or that I'm going to be facing a difficult decision. Do I carry on? Do I shut down my company? No. So in your letter of transmittal, not only do you present your main thesis, but you can also briefly present your conclusions. And yes, the reader will be supportive. And in here, closing, you close by expressing appreciation for the assignment, having a chance to research a topic that you feel really passionate about or concerned with, or just really, you want to know more. If there is follow-up action, if you're writing about climate change, what can I do, right? Should I read this by candlelight? I'm being facetious here. But if there are follow-up actions because of the nature of your work, you can suggest it there. You can acknowledge the help of others if you needed that, offering to answer any questions. And then these questions could be answered as they would typically be in an in-class presentation. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that. I'm only going to ask you to do a PowerPoint presentation and submit that. But here, for the letter of transmittal, announce the topic in both a sort of wider macro scope, narrow it down to the main thesis, which is the micro part, describe the project and the conclusions, and then express appreciation for having a chance to write this assignment. Obviously, to get marks, you don't have to remind me of that, but giving you an opportunity to study a facet of your business world that you're kind of interested in. Okay, so that's essentially it. Table of contents hopefully is pretty straightforward. Show the beginning page number where each of the report heading appears in the report. Now, you can have more than one on one page, and that's perfectly fine. If you have a list of illustrations, if you have illustrations, you should make a list of them which are separate. Now, they appear on the same page, but if you have illustrations, put them in a separate list. So you will have both the table of contents in terms of the written material and also a list of illustrations at the bottom of the page. So if you want to divide it up, upper half table of contents in the traditional sense, and then in the second half or the bottom half, a list of illustrations if you have them, and you don't need to have them necessarily. These illustrations would be tables, illustrations, figures, and wherever they are, make sure that it's identified clearly in the table of contents, but under listing. Okay, introduction, as I mentioned as well. It explains the reason or the purpose of the report. Why does it exist? What is it seeking to do? What is it hoping to change? Also, the problem that's motivating the report. Again, to use climate change as a possible example, or forest fires, or something like that. This is important because you are hoping as a writer to educate the reader in how to do their own little part to change the world to make it a better place. That could be it. if you're speaking, of course, about climate change. You can clarify the scope and the limitations of the report. I'd mentioned, I think, a couple of weeks ago that the report should be doable within 10 to 12 pages. So the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, probably not a good idea because it would take you 10 pages just to establish your premise. So the scope of the paper is where you say, I have chosen this as my main theme because I wish to focus on this in the required amount of number of words or pages. So there's nothing wrong with clarifying the scope because there you say, look, we're going to leave outside of the scope of this paper the following issues. And there's nothing wrong with that. What you're doing is you're telling the reader, I'm aware of these issues, but I don't have the room in this reasonably short paper to address all of these things. My main focus is this, right? The relationship between climate change and forest fires, something we're seeing in Western Canada right now and across the Western US, a serious problem. And the relationship between these two, every year it gets clearer and clearer. So clarify the scope and limitation of the report, partly because of the allowed time and partly because of the scope of the report. It would be 300 pages rather than 10. So you don't want to be doing that. At this point, too, you can mention some of the relevant literature that you found either through Google Scholar or through the digital library, or if you're doing a work that is specific to where you're from, which is either India or the Indian subcontinent, you are looking at specific sources in the Times of India or a specific newspaper from that area. There's nothing wrong with that, and it is clearly relevant because it is a paper written from that area. So they are looking at and watching things on a daily basis rather than kind of parachuting someone in somewhere to follow up, with an issue. So relevant literature, why is it relevant? How is it relevant? Describing data sources, methods, and key terms. Here's where, if you are writing something that you may not be sure whether the average person knows what a certain term means, here's where you can describe it. Right? You can actually say, I'm going to provide the following definitions before we even start so that the reader is clear on what they mean and how I use them. And then finally close by previewing the report's organization. You can mention why you have structured the report the way you have. Is it historical or chronological? Roughly the same thing. Are you going for most important to least important or the other way around? You can point out why you've structured the report in the way that you have, because it is important. Now, the body paragraphs, of course, they are important. That's where you do, the discussing, the analyzing, the interpreting, the evaluating of the research findings, right? You're starting to put them together. And as you are putting them together and finding common links or even disagreements, right? That's important too. So, however you want to line up your research findings through discussion, analysis, interpretation, and evaluation, that will lend you or move you towards a possible solution to the problem. And clearly a problem as vast as climate change, it isn't going to be the only solution, but it could be one small but significant solution to a huge problem. And again, that's where the scope, right, of the paper will really matter. As well, in the body paragraphs, you want to arrange those findings in a logical sequence that is really, again, it's up to you how you wish to set it up. Is there a history to this problem, right? Does this problem have a historical precedent? Did something change at a certain point in time that over the next 20 years made matters worse? Can you identify that first time something happened? Because if that's the case, then your paper, in a sense, will already structure itself. So decide how you want to set it up, and you can remind the reader in the introduction how and why it's set up this way, and then just follow suit. Now, what I tell students usually at this point is write a very rough introduction, point form even, and finish writing the body paragraphs. Then read through, and what I typically do, for the book that's coming out very shortly, what I did is I wrote down as I read through just point form, so that when I came to writing my introduction, it wasn't an introduction to something that is just in my mind. It's a done deal, right? It's finished. So I'm looking at what I actually wrote down. And again, things will change. As you discover new things and you analyze differently, interpret differently, different solutions will come up. The same problem will be there, but maybe a slightly different solution will come up. So when all of that is done, go back and write your introduction. But really the focus should be on finishing the body paragraphs. A rough or point form introduction is fine, but finish your body paragraphs or the body of the report, read through it, and just see what you actually ended up with. Then write that report based on those point forms, and you will have an excellent introduction. And then finally, in the body paragraphs, you can sort of use descriptive headings that will break down the individual paragraphs into sort of smaller, digestible chunks of information. Excuse me again. And then that way you can read through, as well as myself read through, and find these little subheadings. So here you're going to deal with this issue, and you're going to deal with that issue. And as you go through, it becomes pretty clear how this thing is flowing. Okay, so you can group your facts and findings into 3 to 5 roughly equal segments that don't overlap, because you're going to be looking at different things. Now, this becomes very important when you're working in a group where people don't end up overlapping and writing about the same thing from 2 slightly different perspectives. That's not likely to happen because you're writing on your own, but still make sure that it doesn't happen, that you don't overlap and sort of look at the same issue from a slightly different perspective. So look at it and say, okay, I want to look at these sort of 5 subcategories. And those 5 subcategories are simply going to be the 5 sections of your body paragraphs. So there's certainly nothing wrong with organizing it like that. Now, however you organize it is up to you. By time, right, historically or chronologically, same thing. By components, by importance, right, most to least or least to most, whatever. By criteria, by convention, or some other method. It could be that the issue is a really unique one, and it takes approaching it in a particular way. You might need to provide a background first, which of course that section will be called background and definitions. So all these kinds of things are very, very important. So that is essentially the way in which the body paragraphs are going to be set up. And you want to supply at least a brief introductory statement at the beginning of each of the sections, so we know essentially in more detail what these brief headings actually mean. The headings are good, they're useful, they can orient us towards the next set of or pieces of information, but the introductory statements really are helpful because I read that heading, or you can call it a subheading if you want. I read this subheading, and then typically the first thing I want to read when I start reading the paragraphs is a further explanation of what this sort of brief and very terse little statement actually means, right? How does it relate to the larger picture, to the main theme, to the sort of the more wider perspectives? So that introductory statement is very useful. But again, it says at least 1 per page to describe each of the sections. I don't need an introductory statement to each paragraph, but what I do need is one at the very beginning, or at least immediately following the next heading that we see. Informal conversational writing is perfectly fine. You don't want to overdo it using slang unless you're writing a paper on slang, which in this case you're not likely. But you want to keep it informal as opposed to formal, which is very businesslike or scientific writing. You can write that way, but you are going to alienate a certain member, or members of the population who may not understand what you're saying. So if you use a more conversational tone in your writing, you will be able to reach a wider audience. Certainly, I will be reading it regardless. But if you need to write in a formal tone, I don't know if there would be a reason why. Providing you give me definitions, you can write it that way. But an informal conversational writing style is simply one that is fairly straightforward, using commonly known words. Refrain from contractions, will not as opposed to won't, or I will as opposed to I'll, right? These kinds of things you want to keep in mind. Now, as you're writing, there's no reason why you can't use lists. You can highlight them with bullets, and you can or little arrows, whatever you want to use. Just be mindful, though, that if you use numbers, you are implying to the reader that the first item on that list is of the highest importance. So what that means is, if you were to provide in your conclusion a list of either recommendations or main thoughts, and you actually looked at those as in order of importance, we'll say, you could use numbers. But remember that when a person sees a list that is numerical, the implication or the idea is that the first one is the most important. So that's why it's better to go with bullets or little arrows or some kind of little signifier, a little square maybe, because then each one of them has its own merits. One is not measured as more or less important than the other. So keep that in mind. And as you're doing lists, always make sure to double space, have your list, double space again, and then continue writing. So that white space is going to, in a sense, frame and surround that list. And it will kind of pop out. It'll be kind of bolded out from the rest of the text because it is a list, right? Visually, I see that it's a list, and visually my eye is drawn to it. And lists are often really useful towards the end of a section, right, in a report, because you can summarize, in this section of this report, we have looked at the following three things, and you have 3 bullet points, and you have the 3 things. So it's good for yourself as a reminder, have I covered all of these things, because this is what I think is important. And secondly, for the reader, that person also can see what you considered to be important. So they are very, very useful. Now, the last thing here that I want to look at is a conclusion. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the conclusion explains what the findings mean in relation to the main thesis, the main problem, as you have explained it and presented it in the introduction. You can make recommendations if you see fit, if the nature of the work requires recommendations. Again, writing about climate change, hey, think twice about using your car, use public transit, try to do the small things that will eventually all make a difference. And it really depends on the nature of the work, whether recommendations are required. Suggest action for solving the problem if requested. If you believe that there are solutions, there are actions, not just words and ideas, but actual actions that can change something, then again, there you can present it, because that is important. Or you can have a summary or conclusion. They both sound like the same thing, but a summary simply is kind of closing down the discussion. Conclusions can open up, right? They can look towards the future. If we continue to do this, we might be able to get a handle on this problem. So conclusion is open-ended. Summary, somewhat close-ended, we'll say. You can review the main points and discuss what actions will follow. That is important. And the other idea that keeps that conclusion or summary open-ended is the appreciation of being willing to talk about it some more. What that means is when you are ready to present your PowerPoint presentation to me, your very, very last thing, here, if you've had a chance to continue reading a little bit more or studying or thinking about the problem a little bit more, it's at that point that you can present some of these new ideas. And you can say, or you can remind me in your presentation, I concluded my report at that time with the following information. I've since continued reading and realized that it's not that I want to change my mind, but I want to add something, right? So the willingness to provide further information is something that really shows that the book may be written, but the story isn't finished, right? The story continues to be told. So it kind of is an ethical or a moral way to end, discussion of a dilemma, that just because this report's been written doesn't mean it is the end of the problem. The problem will carry on. You're providing a small but significant solution to a problem you've identified and think you can manage, but willing to be open to more ideas, new ideas, more research, more discussion, whatever it may be. So that's all these kinds of things you can present that into conclusion. Now, an appendix is in here, but you don't really need it because any data gathering tools like questionnaires you're not going to be doing. What is important, though, are the references in the bibliography. So, if footnotes are not provided, list all references and works cited or references. Now, footnotes are not provided. You should have, if you're writing an APA, you will be giving me the relevant in-body citation information in parentheses, and you should not need footnotes or endnotes. That's one of the significant differences between APA writing and, say, Chicago style, MLA style, where each of those often have footnotes or endnotes, because these are important to show further clarification. But at the very least, in endnotes and footnotes, to show where the material came from, right? That's the first and foremost reason why they're there. In an APA format, that information is in the body, the in-text paragraphs, right? In the body paragraphs, and they are in parentheses. So even though you do that, you still need to provide a works cited page, so the person reading it can see all of your citations, all of your sources in one place, rather than having to leaf through the whole thing. So headings, just to go back to the body paragraphs, headings are short and clear statements about the general tone of the preceding paragraph, what's coming up. You can sort of experiment with a structure. You can, let's say, if somehow you can answer the 5 W's, right? Who, what, where, why, when. Let's say you want to have fun, and you're going to have these as your 5 main headings. I'm not saying do that because it can be difficult. There could be a when and a where that could be really difficult to pin down. But you can experiment with wording. Don't worry so much about having a complete statement with a heading. A heading is something like right here, providing reader cues, right there. That's a heading. So it's not a statement or a sentence in the normal sense of the word, but the heading can be written dramatically or certainly clearly, but it needs to be there to provide some guidance to the reader. I would recommend 1 heading per report page. Now, if you have a couple, that's fine. But if you have little digestible chunks, let's say 1 paragraph, I don't think 1 single paragraph requires a subheading. So look at it and say, well, can I eliminate some of them, right? You can give yourself lots and lots of these little subheadings, but when you're done, read through and see whether that heading really is helpful. If it isn't, you can just take it out. And you may have, let's say, over a total of 5 or 6 written pages, you might have 5 headings. That sounds about right. That sounds about average. Okay, so that's it. Any questions? If you have any, when we meet in a few days, please do have those in mind, and we're going to discuss that very shortly. In the meantime, take care, and we'll talk to you soon.